So continuing my series going over all of the information we have on the second Diablo 4 expansion, Lord of Hatred, we now get into the pretty massive overhaul and new additions to the Endgame, because not only will this system be adding a new way to partake in all Endgame content, but pretty much all of the Endgame pieces of content will also be getting their own meta progression skill trees that can allow you to completely change up how that content works. And these new endgame additions are all within the new Warplans system, but before we get into that, we are getting a new piece of endgame content that isn't within this system because it's more of a reward and a rare drop for doing any other content in the game. And this is the new Echoing Hatred content. So doing pretty much any endgame content, or it sounds like pretty much anything in the game, you will have a chance to get what's essentially a rare ticket, which will allow you to do a run of Echoing Hatred. Now, Echoing Hatred is essentially a horde mode piece of content that every new wave you complete will increase the difficulty, but also increase the rewards. So you're realistically just thrown into a big room, and it's an infinite horde mode where things just continuously spawn. There are 4 pylons or shrines in the room as well to allow you to get some additional boosts when you want them. But it's also pretty interesting in this is that you will see the difficulty change as you get higher and higher in the waves. So presumably once you get into this, you will just start at like normal difficulty, and then as you complete more and more waves, it'll keep going up in difficulty. Then you'll get into the torment tiers, and it'll keep going through the torment tiers. And again, the more waves you complete, the more rewards you get at the end. And what you're actually facing seems to be completely randomized. It's randomized between what enemies you're facing. It's even randomized on if you're going to get a boss that wave, or if you could have a wave that's like 4 different bosses. It also seems that every boss you defeat while going through all of these waves will also give you an additional bag of loot at the end, or at least that's what they showed in the small amount of footage we've gotten for this content. And presumably because Echoing Hatred is going to specifically be a rare reward for doing anything else in the game, it seems like this content will be pretty heavily juiced, and because you could just get more and more rewards based upon how strong your build is and how many waves you could do, you will probably want to save these tickets for later on where your build is a bit more formed and you're much stronger as a build in general. And what's also quite interesting about this piece of content is it's not only an element of survival, there is also a bar, so you have to defeat enemies quickly enough so that bar doesn't completely fill. That bar is pretty much an indicator of how many enemies are in your Echoing Hatred. So if you let that bar completely fill up, you also lose because you couldn't kill enemies fast enough. So this isn't just get as tanky as you can be and survive as long as you can. You also have to defeat enemies quickly enough to not fill up that bar to also lose. And that's the one new big piece of new endgame content that's completely new, but all of the other endgame pieces of content are going to play in completely different ways because of the new Warplans system. Now, as mentioned, pretty much all of the new endgame content and features are within the Warplans system, and there's 2 pieces to the Warplans system. There is the playlist system, which is specifically called Warplans, and then there's the skill tree for every piece of endgame content. Both of these are kind of tied together, and these are really where all of the new endgame stuff is going to reside. And I think we should first go over the playlist section of Warplans. Now, this is the part that's specifically detailed as Warplans, even though the skill trees are directly tied into this. So just to make it a bit more simple, this is the playlist section of Warplans. Now, the playlist section is pretty simple at a baseline. You'll get this small little tree with a bunch of different pieces of content, and you will select 5 different pieces of content you want to go through, and that will be your Warplan playlist for that rank of your Warplans. So you could say select a pit run, a Helltide, a layer boss, and then like 2 Undercity runs. So you're essentially just planning your next 5 pieces of endgame content you're going to be doing, but because it's in the Warplans system, you are also getting additional rewards on top of what you would get. Because also within the Warplans system, all of these different pieces of content you're choosing will also have a randomized rarity of rewards on it. So at a baseline with no rarity modifier modifier on it, it seems that you will just be getting activity experience for completing that content in the Warplane system. And this activity experience is what allows you to level up your skill trees for all of the pieces of endgame content. So let's say you choose a pit run that doesn't have a rarity modifier on it. It would essentially just be giving you activity experience for completing it on top of everything else you would get for just doing that content. So you would still get the normal rewards from a pit run, but then you would also get the activity experience on top of that. But then there's the random different rarity modifiers on it, where let's say you get a random legendary modifier on that content, you could then get a cache of like rings or something. And we don't know exactly how these rewards are going to work or specifically how much this stuff is going to give us. We just got to see that there will be different rewards, like a bunch of legendary rings for completing this one. You could get a bunch of specific crafting materials for completing this. So it's just randomized additional rewards on top of the content you would already be doing. And these randomized modifiers on top of the existing content could also help dictate what content you want to do. Like let's say for instance, you heavily spec into nightmare dungeons. That's mainly what you're trying to do. Well, you could try to select just only nightmare dungeons through the Warplane system, but maybe then there's a Helltide next to it that has a legendary modifier on it that just gives you a ton of additional like necklaces, and you're looking for a well-rolled necklace. You could then choose that instead for that Warplane rank. And the reason I keep saying Warplane rank is because through this playlist system, there is also ranks to it. So as you go through, select 5 different pieces of content for that rank of a playlist run. After you complete all of that, you then go up a rank, and that next rank you would then choose another 5 pieces of content to partake in. As you get higher in the ranks, it will increase the rewards from this playlist system. It will also expand your selection options for your playlist. Now, you will always only be choosing 5 pieces of content no matter what rank you're in, but the amount of selections you have as you get higher in the ranks will increase. So you will just have more options for selecting content that has a rarity modifier on it, or you will have more options to just do the content you want to do. And on top of all of this, when you start a playlist run or a Warplanes run, there will also be different selectors you get to choose between of what it kind of baseline defaults to, but we haven't gotten this specifically explained. They just said you could select different things from like nightmare dungeons to lair bosses or something like that. And it seems that what they're doing is they're just grouping all of the pieces of endgame content into one of 3 pools. So you select one of these pools when you start your playlist run, and presumably that playlist run will have more of that piece of content within that pool. And we don't know if it completely removes the options of getting that content in that specific run of this playlist. It more seems like you're kind of just targeting what you want to do. And also, while explaining all of this, there is a new plan button at the bottom. So it seems that if you selected something you may not want to keep doing, or maybe if it gets too difficult at some part, you should be able to just create a new plan whenever you want. But also keep in mind, you'll want to keep doing the same run, because again, as you get higher into the ranks of that specific playlist run, you get more rewards and more options. And that may have been a bit of a confusing explanation, but once you see the in-game UI, it'll make a lot more sense. There just is a bunch of little details within the system that you kind of have to learn. But I think once you get into it, you see the UI, I think it'll definitely be a lot more simple to actually understand as a gameplay element. But as I mentioned, that's only half of the new Warplanes system, because I think the much more interesting part is going to be every piece of endgame content getting its own meta progression skill tree that will be pretty heavily tied into the playlist system. Now, even though the playlist system will give you the vast majority of the activity experience you get to put points into your endgame skill trees, based upon some recent gameplay we've received, it seems that just doing any content in the game, even if it's not part of the new activity system, will just be giving you activity experience just at a much more reduced rate. Like some of the footage we got to see is they completed, I think, a whisper, and I think they got 1 activity experience for completing that whisper, which would go towards your Tree of Whispers skill tree. But as I mentioned, you get like 25 or more activity experience for completing one of the activities in a Warplane system. So you're still always going to want to be doing Warplanes, but even if you're not in a playlist specifically, you'll still be getting experience for those endgame skill trees. So there will be an endgame skill tree for the pit, layer bosses, hell tides, the tree of whispers, the undercity, nightmare dungeons, and hell tides. So it's pretty much all of the endgame content, but as I mentioned, the new echoing hatred content that is much more of a rare drop and reward for doing other content, but pretty much everything outside of that is going to have its own skill tree. Now it seems like these skill trees can only go up to level 7, so it seems that you'll probably only have 7 possible points you can put in at a time. Presumably you'll be able to respec these pretty freely, like pretty much everything else in the game, but a lot of these skill trees are much bigger than 7 points. In fact, a lot of them have more than double that amount of possible options, so you are really going to have to specialize into what you're actually wanting to go into for these skill trees. And these endgame skill trees are seeming to be much more about modifying the endgame content with new or changed things, rather than just being like basic buffs or increases to loot or difficulty or something like that. Some of these things will absolutely increase the difficulty, but they will be doing it in a much more interesting way. And some of the options I've told us about is quite interesting. And at a baseline, you'll have things like one of the options we got to see for Infernal Hordes, which is called Infernal Bargain Obdicite. You no longer gain gem fragments in Infernal Hordes and instead gain bonus Obdicite. So you're completely removing gem fragments from Infernal Hordes, because not only do you get a bunch of gem fragments at the end, especially if you get the resource chest, but you also get gem fragments after every wave of Infernal Hordes. So instead of getting those gem fragments, they are essentially replacing them with Obdicite. That's a pretty massive change and will just allow you to target farm the resources you're actually looking for, because also keep in mind, going into the expansion with the Heradra Cube, there are going to be a lot more new materials or resources for all of these different crafts, and being able to target farm certain things over other things is going to be quite important. And what's also quite interesting in this option, specifically in the Infernal Horde skill tree, is when they were scrolling over this specific option in the skill tree, another option that they didn't scroll over got a red X on it. So my presumption here is that if they choose this, it doesn't allow the other option, because the other option would more than likely be you remove Obdicite from Infernal Hordes, but instead get a lot more gem fragments or maybe some other resource, so you can't choose both of them. So there is going to be some pretty heavy material optimization through these skill trees. But then a lot of the other options we got told about actually have, I think, a lot more interesting options. Like we got to see some stuff from the layer boss skill tree, which were specifically adding layer bosses to other content. For instance, one of them gave a chance for the Beast and Ice to just spawn when you're facing any boss in an Infernal Horde, which could then give you loot from the Beast and Ice just for doing an Infernal Horde run. It's not like you're using any resources or anything like that. You're just having a chance for a layer boss to spawn in while you're doing a Helltide run. That one was specifically when facing a boss in a nightmare dungeon. So it seems that some of the skill trees are going to allow you to just add content from that system into a different piece of endgame content. So specifically with layer bosses, it seems there's going to be a bunch of options to add the chance for layer bosses to spawn in other pieces of content. We also got to see one where while doing a nightmare dungeon run, there's a chance for the beast that Astaroth rides to just spawn anytime you're in a nightmare dungeon, which can drop loot from Astaroth specifically. But these options are just showing that not only will you be able to buff up and change the content you're partaking in, but you will also be able to add elements of one piece of endgame content to another piece of endgame content. So if you really don't like doing layer bosses normally, you could just fully go into the options that can spawn layer bosses in other pieces of content, which won't take the boss summoning materials and will just allow you to focus on that other content, which is quite good, just allowing you to buff up the content you actually want to do and generally skip the content you don't really enjoy doing. And obviously, both of those options would make Nightmare Dungeons much more difficult. Also considering that we're going to have up to Torment 12. If you're doing like a Torment 9 Nightmare Dungeon and a boss ladder boss randomly spawns in, that's going to be significantly more difficult to complete that Nightmare Dungeon. So there's gonna be a pretty big increase in difficulty, but then some of the options they told us about for Helltides are also interesting. The first one was that when you get a Bloodseeker to spawn in, which is after you fill up your threat meter, Bloodseeker, and then it drains and you defeat the waves of enemies. At the end, it spawns at Bloodseeker. Instead of that Bloodseeker, you could have 2 Butchers spawn in its place, which would probably be much more difficult and much more rewarding than the Bloodseeker. But another really interesting option for Hell Tides is you now lose all of your cinders when you die instead of half cinders like right now, but you gain a lot more cinders for doing anything in Hell Tide. So that is much more risky, but much more rewarding. And again, when you consider we have up to Torment 12, go and try to do like a Torment 10 Hell Tide with that activated. That would be absurdly rewarding, but you mess up and get hit by like 1 AoE or something and you're probably dead and just lost all of your cinders. So there's going to be a lot of new options in the new endgame skill trees. So when you mix in these new Warplans systems, both with the new playlist system and with the new endgame skill trees, and you mix that in with the fact that we'll have up to Torment 12, which will just allow you to make any content in the game as difficult as you want, the endgame going into expansion 2 is going to be pretty much completely overhauled compared to what we have right now. You are going to partake in endgame content in a completely different way with a playlist system. You are going to completely change up that endgame content with the new skill trees, and you are going to completely change the difficulty options you had with going up to Torment 12, allowing you to just do any content in the game as difficult as you could possibly make it, all while getting significantly more rewards than we were getting previously. Now, I think there's going to be a complete rebalancing of how rewarding different content is because of this, but I think if you really specialize into something, you'll be able to farm specific things much more efficiently than you were able to previously, but you're going to have to target that stuff a lot more as well, and that's also going to come after you've already done a lot of endgame content to be able to get the activity experience, to get the skill points in your endgame skill trees. So there's definitely going to be a lot more things to progress through, but it's also going to be a lot more rewarding once you get to that point. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.